This is going to include the trace ID value for all of the logs inside of the current API request, and this is going to allow me to observe my distributed traces from Jaeger, find the trace identifier on a specific trace, and then I can go into Seek and look for any logs with this trace identifier value. I'm going to show you how all of this works later in a demo. I also added a simple extensions class that's going to allow me to introduce this middleware, and then let's go ahead and add it to the request pipeline. So right before we introduce the serial log middleware, let's go ahead and say use log context trace logging. And we are almost ready to test out our OpenTelemetry implementation. The one thing that we are missing is a service that is going to process our distributed traces. So let's open up the Docker Compose YAML file, and we're going to introduce an additional service here, which is going to be Evently Jaeger. We're going to run the Jaeger tracing all in one image. I'm going to give this container a descriptive name, and then we're going to expose some ports that Jaeger uses to ingest data, as well as this port that's going to allow us to access the Jaeger user interface. And one more thing I need to introduce is an environment variable where we are going to export our OpenTelemetry traces. The name of this environment variable is OTel exporter OTLP endpoint. I'm going to leave the empty value in my app settings JSON file, and then I'm going to add the actual value inside of my app settings development JSON. And as you can imagine, this is going to point to our Jaeger instance, which is running on HTTP Evently Jaeger, and then the port is 4317. And all of this matches the values that we have inside of our Docker Compose YAML file. If I open up Docker Desktop, you will be able to see that the Evently Jaeger container is up and running. So we have our service consuming our OpenTelemetry traces. And now I'm going to go ahead and register a new user and create some traffic inside of our application. After I have sent a few requests to our API, I'm going to move into the Jaeger user interface. If I navigate to localhost 16,686, which is the port where we configure the Jaeger user interface, this is what we will be greeted with. We can choose the service that we want to see our distributed traces for, and I'm going to pick Evently API, and then you can click Find Traces to see a list of the latest traces. You can also increase the number of results that you want to see, and then you're able to see the application traces that we have exported using OpenTelemetry. You can also filter these traces based on the operation. So for example, if I look for the get cards trace, this is going to give me the two traces that I have for the API request to get the customer's cart. So let's take a look at this one, which has 7 spans inside. You can think of a span as a single operation inside of an overall trace. So let's take a look at the trace that we have here for getting the customer's cart. And if you expand the trace, you can take a look at the tags that are available here, which contain some additional information. Here is our request module, and we can see that this is sent to the ticketing module, and we can also see the request name tag with the get cart query. And we introduced these values from the request logging pipeline behavior, which we implemented as a cross-cutting concern. Then if we take a look at some other spans that we have, you will see something interesting here. This is coming from our HTTP client instrumentation, and this is a request to our Evently identity service. So we are sending a request to Keycloak to fetch the well-known OpenID configuration. And if you recall from the authentication chapter, this is how we are able to validate a JSON Web Token. Our API is going to reach out to the Keycloak service and obtain the OpenID configuration, and then using this is going to validate our access token. If we take a look here, you can see another request to access the certificates from Keycloak, and this is also part of our authentication flow. Then we have a database span, and if we expand the tags, we can see the actual query that is being sent to our database. And in this case, it's the query to fetch the user's permissions, and this is made available by the MPG SQL instrumentation. If we continue with our review, we can see some spans from Redis, and this is part of our cart service, which is using Redis as a backing store for the customer's cart. And you can see that the source for this is the Stack Exchange Redis instrumentation. So we're going to get the customer's cart from Redis as a part of this request, and if it's there, we're going to return this value to the user. Another thing I can do is take the actual trace identifier from the URL, and if I go into the Seek dashboard, I can create a filter by the trace ID, and passing the value that we got from the Jaeger user interface. And here we can see all of the logs that belong to this application request with this trace identifier value. And we can see that we are processing the get user permission query, which is our authorization component, and then we are executing the endpoint to get the customer's cart. Here you can see the logs from the get cart query, and finally we are returning the response to the user. If I go back to the Jaeger dashboard, let me look for this operation, which is sending our user registered integration event. And if I open up the one trace that we have, you can see how we are sending the integration event, and then we are processing this event from two consumers inside of our system. So the first one is going to log this operation, inserting into the ticketing inbox messages. So this is our inbox working in the background. And then you can see another trace here, inserting the same value into the attendance inbox messages. So in both examples, you can see how our inbox pattern is processing the integration event that we sent from the users module. Let's slowly wrap up our discussion about OpenTelemetry and distributed tracing. As part of this lesson, I showed you how to introduce a few instrumentations into our application for ASP.NET Core, the HTTP client, MPG-SQL, Redis, and a few other components. And then I showed you how we can export all of this data into a distributed tracing service called Jaeger. All of this gives us some excellent insights into our system and improves the overall observability. On top of this, we also connected our application traces with our structured logs so that we can both monitor the traces inside of Jaeger and then monitor the specific logs for a particular trace inside of the Seek dashboard. In the next lesson, we will be implementing distributed messaging into our system and introducing RabbitMQ.